back for another episode of Standpoint. This is part of the Quick Point series where every week we take one news story, the biggest news story of the week, break it down for you and give you a little bit of my standpoint as to why it matters for you. Listen, the biggest story this week happened over this past weekend, which was the hostage rescue in Gaza. 4 Israelis that were being held hostage for over 7 months in Gaza were rescued in a daring rescue operation that was led by Israel's Special Forces, the Yamam unit, Y-A-M-A-M, one of the best units in the military. And they were able to save Noah Argamani, which, by the way, she's one of the faces of this war. There's an image of her seared in everyone's mind, a video of her on the back of a motorcycle being taken hostage from the Nova Music Festival by terrorists, actually, quote unquote, civilians, actually, that were taking her, supposed civilians, and her boyfriend is walking next to her, being held by 2 terrorists, also dressed as civilians. So Noah's a beautiful girl. Her mom, if you remember, is dying of brain cancer. She's actually Asian. I think she's Chinese. Been living in Israel for many, many years. So we had Noah Argamani and then 3 men, Almog Meir John, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomi Ziv. These 4 innocent hostages were saved by the Israeli Defense Forces this last week. This is a mission that is something that you couldn't even write about. It's the kind of thing that you see in movies. It's actually, in fact, the kind of mission that the United States and the world community was urging Israel to take. People kept sort of trying to quarterback this war in Gaza and saying, well, Israel shouldn't be using heavy artillery, shouldn't be using the Air Force. They should just do precision strikes, send in their commandos. This is exactly that, as the news is coming out day in and day out after the rescue. On Saturday, we're learning more and more details. We're learning that Israel learned about the whereabouts of these 4 hostages about a month before, and about 2 weeks after that, they sent in 2 different quote-unquote families, men and women, disguised as Arabs from Gaza, displaced from the south of Gaza, got there. They rented an apartment on the street that Noah Argamani actually was being held, which was just 200 meters away, which is 200 yards for those, give or take, for those who don't follow, right down the street from the apartment where the 3 men were being held together. Again, this hostage rescue is something that movies are written about. All 4 of them came back in relatively good health. We saw them smiling. We saw them, they weren't emaciated, obviously very pale, hadn't seen the sunlight in a long time. But all in all, at least physically okay. We know the mental wounds are something where that they'll live with for the rest of their lives. And we'll never really know everything that they went through. But rather than celebrating, the mainstream media actually flipped this on Israel, which is incredible. Because why? Because Hamas came out and immediately they said, well, over 200 Gazans were killed in the rescue mission. The final number they landed on, I think, that they picked out of some hat was 274. How many of those were combatants? How many of those were holding the hostages? How many of those died in friendly fire during the firefight back and forth? The answer to those questions is no one cares. No one even cares to ask the Gaza Health Ministry, which means Hamas. No one asks them. No one even expects them to tell the truth, but they do care that over 200 quote-unquote Gazans, when I say quote-unquote because they may have been, and most of them, I'm sure, were Hamas militants, and we'll tell you more about that in a second. But nobody cares. They just see 4 hostages killed, 4 hostages rescued, 200 killed. Like, is that the actual ratio that's appropriate? Again, the whole narrative, the nonsense narrative of Israel's being heavy-handed and even worse, committing genocide, which is another ridiculous claim. The mainstream media ate it up. They ate up Hamas's claim. They're eating out of their hands, and they're doing the work of Hamas. Now, before getting into the responses from the mainstream media, let's talk about the fact that these hostages were being held not in Hamas tunnels, not in Hamas infrastructure, which we know we're seeing them actually in hospitals and in schools, but not even there, but in civilian homes, in a crowded residential neighborhood next to a mall. Now, this isn't new. We've seen previous hostages that were released in hostage exchanges, hostage exchange for prisoners, actually, in the previous ceasefire deals, including Mia Shem, who I was lucky enough to meet and actually interview, who was held in a private home. The details of that are horrifying. Others were held, of course, in tunnels. Others were held in hospitals. We hosted here in Miami several families that were held hostage, women and children who were held in quote-unquote hospitals, dozens of people in a room in a quote-unquote hospital. And again, I keep saying quote-unquote because a hospital is a place where you treat people, not a place where you keep hostages. But that's in regular life, not in Gaza land, Hamas stand, where Hamas, a terror organization, is holding innocent civilians hostage in hospitals, in schools, in apartment buildings. So no one's really talking about the fact that these 4 hostages were being held in a crowded residential neighborhood. And when the Yamam force, Israel's undercover strike teams, hit, 2 things happened. When they went into Noor Argamani's apartment, they got her out with no resistance. But when they went in to the apartment where the 3 men were being held, there were 30 guards, according to reports, at the apartment. They decided to go in anyways. And the commander of that unit, Arnon Zamora, went in first. I know all the military people listening to this will really take note of that. The highest ranking member of the strike team, Arnon Zamora, went in first, knowing that he was going to take fire. He indeed did take fire the second he opened the door and was killed on the spot. Actually, this rescue mission was then renamed and will be named in the history books the Arnon mission, Arnon hostage mission, after Arnon Zamora. May his memory be blessed and may God avenge his blood. And when they went in to save these 3 innocent hostages that were at a music festival 7 months earlier and were kidnapped and were being held in an apartment in the middle of Gaza, guess what? The Hamas members that were there and all these friendly neighbors didn't just turn them over and roll out a red carpet. Quite the contrary. A huge firefight ensued. You see videos of it all over online. You could see it yourself, of dozens and dozens and dozens of Hamas fighters with RPGs and weapons and Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, shooting and attacking the IDF forces. In fact, when the IDF was able to extract the 4 hostages, they were driving with their vehicle. Again, there's videos of this and images online, and the vehicle was disabled. It was shot out by these quote-unquote civilians that everyone's so worried about. But Israel did have a plan to rescue these folks, and the IDF came in with heavy artillery. We had the Air Force, we had the Navy, and we had brigades on the ground, actual military force on the ground that was able to extract them. They got a helicopter on the ground and took them out. No other Israeli was killed other than Arnon Zamora, and these 4 innocent hostages were taken out, and just minutes later were in a hospital in Tel Aviv reunited with their families. So again, out of these 274, which is a number we all know historically based on all these previous numbers, any number that Hamas has ever come out with that has been challenged or checked has been inflated. But even using their number, how many of those were combatants? How many of those were actually fighting against the IDF, trying to keep them from rescuing these hostages? Hamas doesn't say, and the world doesn't ask. Remember, that used to be the job of the media, to ask questions. But let's talk about the mainstream media, because there's 2 parts of the story. One is what a tremendous, tremendous mission that the IDF was able to pull off. I mean, something that should be written about in history books, should be taught in military academies. I'm sure it will be something that should be celebrated by society all over the world. But that's not the mainstream media. They've officially lost their mind. The mainstream media officially is working for Hamas. Let's just go through some examples. I still don't have the fancy tech on the podcast. This is episode 30. We'll get there. We'll be able to pop up these headlines on the screen for you all to see them. But here they are. Just 6 that I pulled out. Sky News, the wonderful Sky News from the UK. Here's their headline after 4 innocent hostages were rescued by the IDF. Quote, over 200 Palestinians killed as 4 Israeli hostages rescued by the IDF. Look what they lead with. Over 200 Palestinians killed. Do they say 200 Hamas members killed? 200 combatants? They don't. The lead story is that 200 Palestinians were killed as 4 hostages were rescued. It's not a good enough number for them. Al Jazeera, I had to throw them in there. Question is if they're mainstream media, but if you look at their viewership, it's insane. And of course, Al Jazeera is funded by the government of Qatar. Their office in the Middle East used to be actually in Jerusalem, which is insane. Israel finally has come to its senses and closed its offices. They're the biggest purveyors of anti-Semitism, in my opinion, in the media. Here's their headline after 4 innocent hostages were rescued. Calls to end Gaza bloodbath after Israeli attack kills 274 Palestinians. You heard that right. Calls to end Gaza bloodbath after Israeli attack kills 274 Palestinians. Yep, no mention of the hostages. Israel just went in and killed 274. That's the narrative they're going with. Of course, if you read the article, but who reads the article? It talks about the fact that 4 hostages were rescued, but that's not the angle of the article. The angle of the article is IDF committed a, quote, bloodbath. Ridiculous. Let's go back to the UK and then we'll come over here to the US. It's not much better. The Guardian. Here's the Guardian's title of their article about what happened in Gaza, the hostage rescue. Outrage over massacre in Gaza as Israel rescues 4 hostages. I'll read that again. Outrage over massacre in Gaza as Israel rescued 4 hostages. They really should have just removed over massacre in Gaza. Outrage as Israel rescues 4 hostages, because that's what they're trying to say. They don't want to see Israel rescuing its hostages. They want them to just ask please and see what happens with Hamas, the terror organization who's holding them. That's Guardian. That's the news in the UK. But let's come over here to CNN. CNN says Israeli operation rescues 4 hostages and kills scores of Palestinians. I mean, the moral equivalence there is insane. Israeli operation rescues 4 hostages. That's great. And kills scores of Palestinians. Again, who are these Palestinians that were killed? CNN didn't care to ask. That title wouldn't even be written if it was just kills scores of Hamas members who were holding those hostages, right? That's not even a story. The story is Israel's killing, the insinuation, killing just innocent Palestinian civilians just to save their hostages. That's what CNN wants you to read into. Now, the wonderful New York Times, and that's being sarcastic for those who can't get that. The title of their article is Israel rescues 4 hostages in assault that kills scores of Gazans. Look at that, almost exactly the same as CNN. Instead of just calling them Palestinians, they call them Gazans. Of course, not Hamas members, not people holding the hostages, not people protecting the hostages, I guess, keeping them, not the hostage holders, just normal everyday Gazans, according to the New York Times. And the Associated Press, who is absolutely ridiculous in these times, have always been, but now is just out of hand. Here's the question in their title of their story. What does Israel's rescue of 4 captives and the killing of 274 Palestinians mean for truce talks? That's the title of the AP's article. And look, it doesn't end in the mainstream media. If I was going through all the comments by elected officials, by politicians, we'd be here all day. It wouldn't be quick point. It would be long point. But let's just go to the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who mourned the loss of those killed in Gaza during the rescue operation. Mourned the loss. I'm going to read the whole quote. Thankfully, 4 of those hostages were reunited with their families tonight. And we mourn all of the innocent lives that have been lost in Gaza, including those tragically killed today. That's right. For the Vice President, it was tragic that those holding the innocent hostages, the innocent civilian hostage, the terrorists that were holding them hostage, the terrorists that were fighting against the Israeli Defense Force who were there to rescue the hostages, it's tragic that they were killed. In her world, in the kumbaya world of Kamala Harris and the mainstream media, no one would be killed. The IDF would walk in and ask for the rescue of the hostages, just hand them over, right? I mean, remember, there's 4 Americans being held hostage in Gaza right now. The United States is asking, they're not getting them. Maybe they're afraid to get their hands dirty. Now, there's 2 takeaways from all of this. One is the world simply cannot accept the Jewish nation fighting back. On October 7th and a few days thereafter, the whole world was behind Israel. Israel was again the victim. The videos, the images of October 7th, of the massacres of October 7th, the mass rapes. Those videos, which you could still see online, which today people throw away as AI and garbage like that, even though they were videos that were actually uploaded by Hamas themselves. The videos that they took, they wanted the world to see. When Jews and when the Jewish state is in the seat of the victim, in the position of the victim, the world is with them. But now that Israel's doing the hard work of fighting and eliminating the enemy, which is Hamas, and trying to rescue the hostages, the world simply cannot handle it. Hamas does not want a ceasefire. For everyone calling for Israel to accept a ceasefire, Israel keeps offering ceasefires. Hamas does not want a ceasefire. Hamas wants victory. And the only victory that Israel should hand Hamas is a one-way ticket to the 72 virgins that each of them think they are going to meet in the afterlife. Guys, the mainstream media is lost. And as Americans, we can no longer rely on these kind of publications to get our news, and definitely not to get our viewpoints or our standpoints. We cannot lose our ability to think critically for ourselves. The days of getting unbiased news from the mainstream media, if they ever existed, are long over. The disgusting perversion from the mainstream media of the amazing hostage rescue mission in Gaza by the IDF this week, which for the most part was turned into a love fest for Hamas and for those that were harboring and holding those hostages, is really a tipping point. And if any true innocent civilians were killed on that day in the crossfire, then those losses fall at the feet of Hamas, who held hostages in the middle of a residential neighborhood and fought the IDF to try to prevent their rescue. So I'm closing by just telling you all not to buy into the media narrative. Not this week and not ever. Reach the conclusions that you reach yourself in your heart with the facts that you gather yourself. And this week, let's celebrate the biggest news story of the week. The heroic rescue of 4 innocent people in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces in the middle of a residential neighborhood of Gaza. The videos and the details of that rescue mission are going to be written in stone in the history books as one of the most incredible rescue missions in history. Support Israel in its efforts to rescue the remaining 116 hostages. And let's wrap this war up with a victory. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.